Ryan Burns wanted what most smart, driven men in their early 20s want: a full-time job with a high salary doing something he loved, and a girl with whom to share the wealth.
After college, I was looking for something where I could have fun, help people, and make money and meet somebody that, I was a good match with. I was not aggressively looking for a serious relationship, but I was open to dating and meeting new people.
So in the fall of 2007, the ambitious Utah native focused on achieving his first goal: earning a good income with a company that helped people gain access to attorneys and legal counsel.
I knew that there was people making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year with the company, so that's what intrigued me.
But by December of 2007, just a few months after he started as a sales associate, Ryan found himself struggling. So he decided to attend a local training meeting where one of the company's top executives named Travis was giving a motivational speech.
It was just amazing. Travis gave everything he had that night, and it definitely impacted me. I laughed, I cried, I could relate to him.
Moved by Travis's speech, Ryan worked up the courage to introduce himself, and was very glad he did.
Travis made me feel like $1 million. He gave me some advice. And I left out of that training that night in those 2 hours inspired.
Something that Travis said just clicked with him, and from that point on, he was just successful and doing really well in the company.
Ryan was well on the way to the career of his dreams, but his love life was still lacking. That is, until March of 2008, when he attended his company's annual convention in Oklahoma City and spotted a stunning woman in the crowd.
She was a beautiful blonde girl. She was walking everywhere smiling, and she just seemed like somebody I wanted to definitely go and talk to.
So Ryan was shocked when the attractive blonde made a beeline straight for him.
She stuck out her hand and says, "Hi, I'm Jody." And I shook her hand. I said, "Hi, I'm Ryan," and she was just very forward.
Jody told Ryan she worked in the company's California office and was moving up the ranks to a director position. Ryan was instantly impressed.
She was an attractive woman. We had the business in common, which was great. She just seemed like somebody I'd be interested in getting to know.
The two exchanged numbers, and Ryan hoped this might be an opportunity to achieve both of his goals, professionally and romantically.
I was excited to be able to get her number and know that I could give her a call.
And a few weeks later, Ryan finally mustered up the courage.
We hit it off right away. We had just so much in common about the business and where we wanted to go in life. I had felt like I'd met, the coolest girl on the planet.
Soon, Jody and Ryan were spending hours on the phone every night. But during one late-night chat, Jody revealed she had once dated Ryan's coworker, Travis.
I was surprised, but I didn't ask her much about Travis. She told me her and Travis broke up because of the trust. But he was a great guy.
Ryan didn't want to pry. Besides, he was truly enjoying his promising phone relationship with Jody. He only wished they lived closer.
She started kind of flirting with the idea of coming out and seeing me. So I was excited to spend some time with her and see if, we got along in, a personal one-on-one basis.
So on June 3rd, Jody planned to leave California around 9 p.m. and drive straight through the night to Ryan's house.
She was going to call when she was leaving California. I felt like it was a huge step for somebody to drive 1,000 miles to come and see me. So I was excited.
But when 11 p.m. came and went with no word from Jody, Ryan started to worry.
I called her, she didn't answer, sent her a text around 10 or 11. She didn't answer that. I called her again at 1 and still going straight voicemail. That's when I started really kind of being concerned.
Jody's radio silence made Ryan fear the worst. And he would soon find out his instincts were dead on.
No one could have imagined what Jody was really doing at that time.
She's just evil all the way around.
I was sick to my stomach. She's a monster, a very manipulative monster.
On June 3rd, 2008, Ryan Burns was anxiously awaiting the arrival of his coworker and budding love interest, Jody. After 5 weeks of long-distance phone calls, she was finally driving from California to visit him in Salt Lake City, Utah. But when 24 hours passed without word from Jody, Ryan was beside himself.
I was concerned and I was sick to my stomach. Maybe she got cold feet. I don't know. Maybe she could be seriously hurt. There was definitely something wrong, and I didn't know what it could possibly be.
Finally, that evening, Jody called.
I was relieved. Because at least I knew she was alive. She told me that she got on the freeway in the middle of the night and it was dark and she drove the wrong direction.
Jody explained that her phone had died, and after finally getting back on course, she pulled over for a couple hours of sleep. But she promised to be there by morning. Finally, around 10 a.m. on June 5th, Jody and Ryan reunited in person.
I was just happy and excited. She got out of the car and came up and gave me a big hug and said she was so happy to see me.
But Ryan couldn't help noticing Jody's physical appearance.
First thing I noticed is her hair was not blonde. She had brunette hair. She was looking completely different. Then I noticed she had two little bandages on her hand. I said, "What happened to your hand? Are you okay?" And she basically said that she cut her hands on a margarita glass. She's kind of a klutz like that.
Ryan was excited for the chance to finally spend some alone time with Jody.
And we turned the movie on, and she just snuggled right up. She turned her head, and I leaned over, and I kissed her. It was just, a sweet kiss.
But before things got too heated, Jody announced it was time for her to leave. And the following day, Ryan already found himself missing her.
After she was here, I was more excited about the relationship. The very next conversation that we had, we discussed me going up there.
Ryan was on cloud 9, but when his coworkers saw him the next day, they seemed prepared to bring him back down to earth.
I didn't think Jody was a good match for Ryan. I knew that after she and Travis broke up, she had sent emails to girls that he was dating because she had broken into his email account.
And they had somewhat of a tumultuous relationship. They had trust issues. I was nervous about Ryan dating her, and I didn't think it was a great idea.
Ryan didn't listen to any of it. He was, I guess you'd say, love-struck at the time.
They didn't give me any details. They just said, take my word for it. But I'm enjoying getting to know her, and so it didn't deter me. I just wanted to hear her side.
So on June 9th, during a 3-hour internet chat with Jody, Ryan broached the subject of the trust issues that had ultimately ended her relationship with Travis.
That's when she explained to me. She started going through Travis's phone. She saw that he was actually texting a few different girls, and she said, I was devastated. I couldn't believe that somebody I thought I was in an exclusive relationship was dating other women.
Jody admitted she had broken into Travis's email account too. Clearly ashamed and horrified, she'd stooped to such a low level.
I was surprised, but at the same time, I kind of admired her honesty and the fact that she was open about it and trusted the relationship we had built at that time.
But the next day, Ryan received a call from Jody, and even he wasn't prepared for the shocking words coming out of her mouth.
She was crying. I asked her if she was okay, and she said, he's dead.
I was sick. You hardly can believe it's happening. It's surreal.
I was just so shocked. I thought, man, I might be talking to a killer.
On the morning of June 10th, 2008, Ryan Burns received a frantic phone call from his long-distance love interest, Jody.
She sounded upset. She was crying. She said, he's dead. Travis is dead. I was just shocked by the news. I couldn't figure out what could have gone wrong. I thought it had to be a suicide, but Jody told me that the police, they're looking at it like a suspicious death, and there was a lot of blood.
Ryan struggled to make sense of the news, all the while devastated that a man he looked up to, who was so full of life, was now dead.
I just don't understand how this could have happened. I felt bad for his family. I felt bad for Jody.
But Ryan's co-workers had different feelings and plenty of accusations. They made no attempt to hide their suspicions that Ryan's new love interest, Jody, was involved in Travis's untimely death.
I got a call from Clancy, and she said, "Did you hear the news?" And I said, "Yes." I talked to Jody, and Clancy immediately said, "Don't ever talk to that crazy bee again. Ryan, she killed him. I don't know how she did it, but I'm telling you right now, she did it."
Everyone that knew her and knew Travis suspected she killed him. I mean, I knew with every fiber in my being that it was her.
All of us knew down to our core that she was the one who had killed Travis, and Ryan didn't want to believe it.
I thought it was ridiculous that people would think that she could take Travis on, especially since the guy was athletic at 200 pounds, and Jody was 115 soaking wet. She was a tiny person.
And by all appearances, Jody was just as devastated as everyone else. She'd even assisted police.
Jody spoke to the detective, and she seemed to be cooperating in a normal way and wanted to help in any way she possibly could.
Still, when Jody mentioned 2 weeks later that she wanted to come back to Utah for a visit, Ryan felt torn.
I told her, "I would love for you to come to see me, but honestly, Jody, a lot of people here think you had something to do with Travis's murder, and it would be an extremely awkward time to come and visit me." And she acted shocked. You know, that was the first time she knew people were really suspicious of her.
Ryan quickly assured her once everything blew over, they'd be together. But it seemed things were about to blow up instead. On June 19th, police confirmed the date Travis was killed. A camera had been found inside Travis's home, hidden in a washing machine.
The sheets and a camera they found inside the washing machine had been bleached and had gone through a washing cycle. Police were able to go through it. There were photos that were still on the camera and some that someone had tried to delete. There were timestamps on the photos that showed him being murdered on June 4th, 2008.
When Ryan learned the date Travis was killed, all hopes of a future with Jody completely vanished.
That was mind-blowing information to me, because that means he did die the day that Jody was missing for 26 hours.
With a sick and twisted feeling in his stomach, Ryan's mind flashed back to their visit.
I started piling on the whole trail of inconsistencies, and that she had been missing for 26 hours and her phone was actually off, and the cuts on her hands and her hair being dyed. That's when I started to believe all the things that all my friends had been saying, that she probably had something to do with it. I knew that it was too big of a coincidence.
With only Travis on his mind, Ryan called the Mesa Police Department to tell them about his interactions with Jody.
I'm not going to try to condemn her. I'm not going to try to protect her. I'm just going to tell them exactly what happened and exactly what I knew.
Ryan hoped he had made the right decision. And soon, when the shocking details of Travis's death were made public, it became all too clear that he had.
It was a very grisly scene, a lot of blood.
The state that Travis was found in, it's horrific to think about what he went through.
And I just remember feeling sick to my stomach. It could only be conjured up in a horror movie.
If you have a story for Who the Bleep and would like to appear on the series, go to investigation.discovery.com. In July of 2008, Ryan Burns went to the police about his former love interest, Jody, who he suspected was involved in the murder of their co-worker, Travis Alexander.
The detective wanted to know about my relationship with her and her travel schedule on the 4th. So I told him how I couldn't get a hold of her. The fact that the detective was still asking questions about Jody, I knew that she was still definitely up there in the suspect list.
And as more details of the crime were uncovered, the entire nation was suddenly captivated. It turned out Travis hadn't just been murdered, he'd been completely brutalized.
Travis was found in the shower. He had been stabbed more than 20 times. He was shot in the head, and his throat was slit from ear to ear. This attack was horrific. It was a gruesome crime scene.
It was just unreal finding out how he was actually killed. I don't even know how to explain it. It was horrible.
Initially, Jody denied ever being at Travis's house on June 4th.
Were you at Travis's house on Wednesday?
Absolutely not. I was nowhere near Mesa.
Jody told police she was with Ryan Burns the entire time. She told investigators she drove to Utah on June 3rd, 2008 and stayed there until June 5th. Clearly, she was trying to use Ryan as an alibi.
But the photographs on the recovered camera proved otherwise.
There were photos of Jody and Travis being intimate. There were photos that Jody took of Travis while he was in the shower. From there, the crime started. You can see in the timestamp exactly when Jody started to kill Travis. You see Travis lying bloody on the floor. You see Jody's foot. You see a crime being committed before your eyes.
On the morning of July 15th, 2008, Jody Arias was arrested and charged with the first-degree murder of Travis Alexander.
I felt sick to my stomach. I couldn't believe that I held in my arms a murderer who had just done that to another human being.
And as Ryan tried to come to grips with the truth, Jody decided to change her story, telling investigators she did visit Travis on June 4th, but she didn't kill him.
She told police that two masked intruders had broken into Travis's home and committed the crime, and that she was narrowly able to escape.
But when the police disproved that story, Jody claimed she killed Travis in self-defense.
They said there was no way that this was a likely story. If you are going to kill someone in self-defense, you're not going to stab them more than 20 times and shoot them and slit their throat.
It appeared Jody Arias was nothing but a professional liar, a femme fatale, and was possibly planning to kill again.
They found her with a 9mm, 2 knives, and she was going somewhere. I don't know where she was going and who she was going for, but she was going somewhere.
I got chills thinking, could she have really had that in mind to actually kill again? Could it have been me?
Ryan was eager for Jody's trial to start, but getting justice for Travis wasn't going to be a quick or easy process. It took more than 4 years before Jody had her day in court on January 2nd, 2013.
Jody has seemed to lack emotion. Anytime she cried, to everybody, it felt like fake. It felt like a show for the jury. You'd think there'd be some emotion somewhere. She seemed so disconnected.
Finally, on May 8th, 2013, after 16 weeks of testimony, Jody Arias was found guilty of first-degree murder.
Find the defendant as to count 1, first-degree murder, guilty.
When I heard the conviction, I just felt a relief. She's not coming back into normal civilization ever again. I think it was premeditated. I think she knew what she was doing. I think if anybody deserves the death penalty, she deserves it.
Finally achieved the career success he always wanted, and he finally got the girl too.
I couldn't be happier right now with 2 beautiful children, beautiful wife. We have a great relationship.
To the outside world, David Hummert lived the typical childhood of a New Cumberland, Pennsylvania boy.
I was the oldest of 3. We did a lot of things as a family. We'd go to church every Sunday. And we did the normal family trips, and there were good, happy times.
It was all thanks to David's mother, Charlene, and her devotion to providing a good life for her children.
My mother definitely made sure that we experienced as much good stuff as kids as we could.
Char's kids were everything to her. Anytime you asked about the kids, she knew every little detail about their lives, and she always said it with a smile on her face, no matter what it was.
There was a few times where she got a second job to come up with money to make sure that the kids had actually more than we needed.
David's father, Brian, worked as an IT professional and adored his wife. The Hummerts seemed like an ideal family. But behind closed doors, it was a different story.
My first memory is actually being hit by my dad. That's the first thing I remember, probably when I was 5, 6 years old. Anytime anything upset him, he'd get a belt and smack you with it. He had a very short fuse.
Brian was always hovering near them, and he was very intimidating.
As David grew older, the physical abuse became more severe and more frequent. And one day in 2001, Brian hit a new low.
I believe I was 16 at the time. I normally would ride my bicycle home from school, but the chain had popped off, so my father had come to pick me up. We put the bike in the back, came home, and he was unloading the bike out of the back. The pedal caught the rear seat and put maybe a 1-inch rip in it. I went to go help him lift the bike out of it so it could get uncaught from the seat. He forced the bike back with pretty much as much force as he could, and the tire hit me in the face. Broke my nose, and I kind of thought it was an accident for a second, and then he started yelling and screaming at me that it was my fault that I trashed his interior and I was going to pay for it.
A bewildered David tried to stick up for himself, and for the first time, he fought back against his father.
I just jumped on him and pretty much pummeled him and choked him and threw him to the ground and beat on him for a little bit. And then he's threatening to call the cops for me assaulting him. I was like, call the cops and we'll see who they arrest.
When Charlene got home and found out what had happened, she kicked her husband out of the house and filed a restraining order against him. For 6 peaceful months, David and his family moved forward, while Brian went to live with his parents and sought help with anger management.
Honestly, we were happy. The whole family seemed to get more calm and better and be able to actually live together without yelling and screaming every day. It was pretty nice.
But soon, Brian came crawling back, promising a permanent change. And Charlene let her husband come home.
My mother talked to people from the church and her family and kind of believed, you got married, you stayed married, you worked through your problems. And, that was her belief. She didn't want to be a broken household and, father here, mother there.
David had mixed feelings about his father's return.
I wanted to believe it, but I think I knew that it was going to go back to the same way it was.
But soon, a new cloud of fear would settle over the Hummard family.
If it was meant to terrorize, mission accomplished.
And it would come from outside their home.
It was horrible. I think we lost a lot of nights of sleep.
Felt like I was protecting the entire rest of the family. It was a scary situation.
In early 2001, 17-year-old David Hummert was doing his best to keep peace within his family.
The relationship was still stressed, but I was trying to be there to help with my siblings.
It seemed like there was tension more between him and his father than anyone else in the family.
But that spring, David learned the family's biggest threat wasn't coming from inside the home.
My mother had called me one night and she's like, there's something going on you should know about. I haven't told your brother and sister yet. There's a guy following me around and he has photographs of her. She had taken glamour shots from my father for a Christmas present. He had somehow gotten a hold of prints of them and was stalking her and had left letters at the house and on my father's car and on her car.
The stalker claimed he was following Charlene while she ran errands during the day. And he wrote, "The time is now right for payback." Terrified for their safety, Charlene and Brian called the police.
The one letter was very brief. It was directed towards Brian, and it basically said, "Your wife is a slut. The proof will be coming shortly." And then a short time after that was when the second letter was received, and that had the ripped up photographs of Charlene.
Charlene was very afraid when the stalking incident occurred. It had greatly shaken her up. If it was meant to cause fear, if it was meant to control, if it was meant to terrorize, mission accomplished.
But in the face of these fears, David's father had the opportunity to be the good guy, fighting for his family instead of against them.
The stress of the situation definitely took the focus off of the issues between my father and the rest of the family and focused it towards this guy that was out there everybody was paranoid about and wanted to catch. It united us against a common enemy.
After a few months, the letters stopped coming as abruptly as they started. And while the family was relieved, they still lived with an undercurrent of fear. In the summer of 2003, it seemed the stress had caught up with David's father. He suffered a severe heart attack that nearly killed him.
Came to see me, and he was very apologetic and said, I'm sorry, I know I haven't been a good father, I want to fix things, I want to be better. We couldn't deal with the stress of being angry all the time. He's like, being angry all the time is killing me, and I'm gonna stop it. He was going to counseling, and he was on medication, and he seemed like a good guy, seemed like a totally changed person. And actually started believing that he was gonna change, and was pretty happy about it.
But as Brian's health returned, so too did his violent temper.
8 to 12 weeks after he'd had the heart attack, he asked me to help him move some furniture out of the workshop he had in the basement upstairs, and he'd gotten a splinter in his hand, and he dropped the bench. So I asked him if he was all right, and he turns around, curses at me, and then picks the end of the bench up and just shoves it into my chest. And then I left. I was like, I couldn't deal with it.
David had reached his snapping point. He broke the news to his mother that he would not be coming back home, ever.
She had told me, this isn't your fault, it's his fault. She's like, I want to be done with it. I'm tired of being stressed every day. She just flat out said she wanted to leave him.
But Charlene wanted to wait until the school year was over before telling Brian she was done.
Me and my mother started looking at properties, trying to find like a 2 to 3 to 4 bedroom house that me, her, and my brother and sister could move into. And pretty much the plan was to move as much stuff as possible, as quickly as possible before he realized it, and then she was gonna file divorce papers.
David hoped there would soon be some permanent peace in their lives.
She was finding properties, I was finding properties. We had actually somewhat settled on a place, and we're finalizing if we were gonna put an offer in.
But the future plans David and his mother were so desperate to make a reality would never see the light of day.
It's what we would call a classic whodunit.
It was a complete mystery. We just knew that there was foul play.
When I couldn't get a hold of her, I was starting to get pretty worried. She pretty much vanished into thin air.
The night of March 19th, 2004, started out as any other Friday night for David Hummert.
Sometime around 4 or 5 o'clock, ended up going out with my friends. Stayed out till probably about 4 o'clock in the morning on the 20th.
When David got home, he was stunned to find his father still awake in his study.
It was very unusual to see him up at 4 a.m. in the morning, and he's sitting in normal clothes, not in pajamas or anything. He was just sitting there. He seemed just out of it.
David asked what was wrong, and Brian admitted that he and Charlene had had a blowout fight and that a friend had picked her up.
It was very odd for my mother to just up and leave and not call me or not tell me, but I figured, well, she's finally pissed off enough, she's actually left.
But the next morning, when David awoke, he noticed immediately that his mother's car was no longer in the driveway.
I asked my dad. He said that her truck was gone when he woke up, so she must have come in the middle of the night and got it, and he was just trying to let her blow off steam. So I placed probably 5-10 calls to my mother's cell phone, just trying to get a hold of her, see what was going on.
David's calls to his mother's cell phone went unanswered.
My dad, he said he went driving around looking for her. Couldn't find her car anywhere. It wasn't at any of the neighbors' houses or family members or anything. I was pretty concerned that maybe she was upset and got in a car accident or something had happened that we couldn't get hold of her.
David wanted to call the police, but Brian wasn't ready.
He's pretty matter-of-fact about it. He's like, oh, well, she has to be missing 24 hours.
My father, he had been to Brian's house, and Brian didn't seem upset. My father was very upset by that. This was his younger sister.
As day turned to night and Sunday morning approached, David's concern turned to panic. By now, Charlene had been missing for nearly 2 days. It was time to call the police.
On March 21st, 2004, I received a missing persons report. That officer spoke to Brian Hummert, who told the officer that he had not seen his wife since Friday night, the 19th. So the officer began a search for Charlene and the white Land Rover that she may be in. And a short time later, the officer discovered the Land Rover in the parking lot of a local food store.
Later that evening, David received a disturbing call from his father.
Yeah, he's like, you come home, I need to talk to you. I'm like, why? He's like, just, you need to come home, I'm not gonna tell you over the phone. I don't think I'd dropped below 100 miles an hour the whole way home. My brother and sister were there in the living room. I kind of knew that something bad happened. And he's like, they found your mom in her truck. She's dead. He's like, they don't know what happened. And at the time, I'm thinking it's like a car accident. They found her in the truck. The officer that was there was like, well, would you be able to come in for an interview sometime this week? We know it's going to be hard. And I'm like, an interview? Like what? And they're like, well, there's suspicious circumstances.
As the family mourned, police began taking a closer look at the details of Charlene's death.
At the autopsy, it was confirmed that Charlene strangled with a ligature. Now, ligature being something other than your hands. It's going to be a rope or a cable or something like that. And this was not an accidental or a natural death. Because of the suspicious nature, now we have a homicide investigation. We wanted to get a little bit more background from the family, as well as what else was going on in her life at that time.
I couldn't think who would possibly want to do this to my mother. Yeah, she helped everybody she knew. She was well-liked in the community. Really, the only thing I could think was this stalker.
Investigators immediately began taking another look at the threatening letters Charlene had received 3 years earlier. And when Brian confirmed his son's suspicions, police had their first lead.
Brian brought up this stalking incident and that if Charlene met an untimely death, it could be the work of this stalker.
Leaving no stone unturned, detectives gathered DNA samples from David and his family. They searched the Hummert home for any clues about what had happened to Charlene. They also continued their probing interviews. And that's when David noticed a disturbing trend.
As the time went on with the interviews, it seemed to be more and more pointing towards my father. The questions they were asking, a lot of background on financials and fighting in the household and issues that could lead up to the motive, and it definitely seemed to be leading more and more and more towards him. I kind of tried to push it down and be as impartial as I could.
David clung to the possibility that a stranger had killed his mother, while his father began feeling the pressure of the investigation.
And he's like, they're trying to frame me. They always put it on the husband. Like, you should be careful. They're gonna try and implicate you in it.
But a new development was about to send everything into a forensic whirlwind.
It was one of those come on moments.
My initial reaction when I saw this letter was, we got him.
In April of 2004, as the investigation into his mother's murder picked up steam, David Hummert was distraught as he realized police seemed to be zeroing in on his father.
The police searched several times throughout the investigation. And they were asking me a lot of questions about my father and arguments between my father and my mother.
But a strange new development was about to muddy the waters.
I received a letter at the police station. It was addressed to me. And basically this letter said, I killed Charlene Hummert, not Brian. The letters indicate that this person has killed before. This person's a serial killer. And the next day, the local newspaper received a letter that basically said the same thing. I killed Charlene Hummert, not Brian, but this one went into a little more detail, that only the actual murderer would know that he killed Charlene, brought her back to the house, drug her through the kitchen, then put her in her car.
And the author went on to taunt police, writing, "Cops have no idea how easy it is to try to pin husband."
For a serial killer to claim, I did it, not somebody else, that's almost unheard of. And it began to have some shades of the stalker letters. Because it was a handwritten letter, I was very hopeful that we were going to be able to match up the handwriting. So my initial reaction when I saw this letter was, We got him.
Police immediately sent the letters off for analysis, and that's when they discovered some undeniable similarities.
The author of the serial killer letters had the same linguistic tendencies, the same demographic, same background as the author of the stalker letters.
Armed with these details, police could now prove that the person who had stalked Charlene 3 years earlier was the very same person who had written letters confessing to her murder. Now the question was, who was he?
We knew it had to have been somebody who had to be close enough to Charlene to be able to get that close to her physically. There were different abrasions on her body. That meant she was already killed as she's being dragged through that driveway and loaded into the rear of her vehicle. So the killing had to have happened inside the house. It absolutely leads to only one conclusion, that Charlene Hummert was murdered in her house by Brian Hummert.
Police immediately issued search warrants for Brian's home and work computers. And what they found was shocking.
We were able to find those 2001 stalker letters and actually the photographs that were used in those incidents on Brian Hummert's computer. We also found hard copies of those documents and pictures in the house.
Police also found a makeshift dog leash, the very same type of cable used to strangle Charlene.
The dog cable was found in the computer room, and when the investigators saw it, they went, "Oh my God, that's it."
Brian Hummert was arrested for first-degree murder in November of 2004. For David and his family, the news cut like a knife.
There's relief, anger, sadness. I mean, even as much as I honestly hated the guy, I still didn't want to believe that my father could kill my mother.
It was extremely hard to realize that someone you had in your family did this. The more we found out, I believe, the harder it was on our family.
In May 2012, Brian Hummert was convicted of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison.
Honestly, it was kind of vindicating, of just getting the closure in my mind, saying it's finally done and I can move on.
And while the pain of his mother's death is ever present, David strives to build a life he knows Charlene would be proud of.
I've tried to work hard and be good to other people, but there's probably not a day that goes by that I don't think about my mom. I miss being able to talk to her and get advice, and just, like, she always knew the right thing to do.
There is a profound and heavy silence that settles over the islands of the South Pacific, a stillness that exists in stark contrast to the relentless, rhythmic crashing of the ocean against the volcanic shores. It is a landscape that the rest of the world often romanticizes as a serene paradise, a canvas of endless blue and vibrant green, untouched by the profound darkness that can fester within the human soul. Yet, beneath the canopy of the banyan trees and within the quiet villages that the archipelago, there exist the same intricate, beautiful, and sometimes terrifying complexities of the human condition that can be found anywhere else on Earth. The story we are about to unfold does not take place in a bustling metropolis or down a dark, anonymous alleyway. It unfolds in a sanctuary of art, in a place designed for the elevation of the human spirit, a place where words were meant to heal, to provoke thought, and to celebrate the rich cultural heritage of Polynesia. It is a story about the fragility of the mind, the devastating weight of unseen illness, and the catastrophic shattering of a bond that was built on mutual respect, deep admiration, and a shared devotion to literature. To understand the magnitude of what was lost, one must first understand the space where the tragedy occurred. In the village of Vaivesuda, situated in the capital city of Apia in the independent nation of Samoa, stood the Galamoana Theater. This was not merely a building with 4 walls and a roof. It was a cultural epicenter, a private residence that doubled as a theatrical space and an academic hub. It was intended to be a safe haven for creativity, a dedicated environment where the indigenous voices of the Pacific could be nurtured and amplified. The air inside the Galamoana Theater was historically thick with the scent of old paper, ink, and the invisible energy of countless hours spent drafting, revising, and perfecting the written word. It was a place where prestigious literary awards were conceived, where groundbreaking poetry was given breath, and where generations of Pacific history were meticulously recorded. It was, by all definitions, a holy ground for literature. Imagine walking into that space on a quiet afternoon. The wooden floors, the shelves lined with books that challenge the boundaries of post-colonial thought, the drafts of unpublished manuscripts sitting on desks, waiting for the final stroke of a pen. It is a space of intellectual warmth. Now, imagine that profound, contemplative silence being violently shattered. Not by the passionate delivery of a monologue, nor by the heated but respectful debate of two brilliant scholars, but by the dull, metallic thud of a hammer. The contrast is almost too extreme for the mind to readily process. There is an inherent dissonance in visualizing instruments of brutal, blunt force trauma coexisting with the delicate pages of award-winning poetry. When a physical sanctuary is violated by unimaginable violence, the architecture itself seems to absorb the trauma. The Galamoana Theater, once a beacon of enlightenment and cultural pride, was transformed in a matter of moments into a tomb. The blood that stained the floors of that artistic space did not belong to a stranger, an intruder, or a nameless victim. It belonged to one of the most revered, trailblazing, and deeply loved academic figures in the entire Pacific region. And the hands that wielded the weapons, the hands that swung the hammer and thrust the knife, were the very same hands that had penned internationally celebrated masterpieces, hands that had once been guided and held by the victim herself. This is the central, agonizing paradox of the Vive-Sud tragedy. It is an event that forces us to look directly into the abyss of severe mental illness and acknowledge how completely it can rewrite reality. We are dealing with two monumental figures, two women who represented the absolute pinnacle of Samoan and Pacific Islander achievement. One was the steady, nurturing, endlessly wise mentor who had broken through historical barriers to become a legendary professor and a guiding light for countless young minds. The other was the blazing prodigy, the literary superstar whose raw talent had brought unprecedented global recognition to her homeland. They were not enemies. They were intertwined in a deep, profound relationship of mentorship, friendship, and artistic kinship. They were the roots and the blossoms of the same cultural tree. When a stranger commits a heinous act of violence against another stranger, society can easily categorize the event. We can draw clear lines between good and evil, predator and prey. We can comfort ourselves with the illusion of randomness. But when the violence occurs between two individuals who share a profound history of love and mutual support, the narrative collapses into something far more terrifying and difficult to digest. The mentor had crossed the ocean, traveling from the United States to Samoa with the specific, loving intention of helping her protege. She arrived at the Galamoana Theater not as a rival, but as a lifeline, hoping to pull her dear friend out of a spiraling crisis of mental health. She came armed with compassion, patience, and a lifetime of shared history. She was met, however, not by the brilliant writer she had nurtured for decades, but by an impenetrable wall of paranoia. The illness had taken hold entirely, twisting the familiar face of a savior into the distorted mask of an imagined threat. The tragedy of the mind is that it can seamlessly replace truth with terror. In the grip of severe paranoid psychosis, the world becomes a landscape of imminent danger, and the brain reacts with the primal, uncontrollable urge to eliminate that danger by any means necessary. The resulting violence was swift, brutal, and entirely overwhelming. The 77-year-old scholar, a woman whose life was dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge and the empowerment of her people, was given no chance to defend herself. The sanctuary became a trap, the quiet afternoon became a nightmare, and the instruments of everyday life were weaponized in an explosion of senseless, tragic brutality. What follows an act of such intimate and devastating violence is rarely a moment of immediate clarity for for the perpetrator. There was no sudden awakening, no immediate realization of the horror that had just been unleashed. Instead, there was a desperate, panicked retreat into denial. The doors of the theater were locked, sealing the horrific reality inside with the lifeless body of the mentor. The perpetrator fled the scene, escaping to a neighboring village, carrying the invisible, crushing weight of an act that her fractured mind was only beginning to comprehend. For nearly an entire day, the island of Samoa remained entirely unaware that a massive piece of its cultural heart had been violently excised. The sun set and rose again over the Pacific. The waves continued their eternal rhythm against the volcanic rock, and the Gala Theater sat in complete, agonizing silence, holding a secret that would soon shatter communities across multiple continents. This story does not end with a neat resolution in a courtroom. It does not offer the hollow comfort of a judge laying down a sentence, or a jury delivering a verdict that attempts to balance the scales of justice. The conventional architecture of true crime narratives often relies on the courtroom as the final act, the place where the chaos of violence is ordered and explained by the rigid structures of a law. But the universe, in its dark and unpredictable nature, denied everyone that finality. The legal proceedings were abruptly and permanently halted by a second, deeply disturbing tragedy. Nearly 2 years after the initial bloodshed, while languishing in a prison cell and awaiting a trial that would undoubtedly command international attention, the perpetrator made a final, irreversible decision. The slow, agonizing return of her cognitive awareness, the gradual lifting of the paranoid fog, brought with it a reality too monstrous to endure. To wake up and realize that you have brutally destroyed the person who loved you most, the person who shaped your career and championed your voice, is to awaken in a personal hell from which there is no escape. The realization crushed whatever fragile fragments of sanity remained. Before the courts could speak, before the public could witness a trial, the brilliant, broken author ended her own life behind bars. We are left, therefore, with an echoing, inescapable void. There are no definitive answers, no final testimonies, no cross-examinations to neatly explain away the horror. We are left only with the haunting image of a locked theater, the devastating loss of a legendary educator, and the tragic self-destruction of a celebrated artist. We are forced to navigate the uncomfortable space between brilliant creation and horrific destruction, to understand how a mind capable of weaving award-winning poetry can deteriorate into a state capable of blunt force murder. This journey into the events of May 2024 is not a pursuit of sensationalism. It is an exploration of the profound vulnerabilities of the human psyche. It is an examination of how a culturally rich, deeply spiritual environment can still be vulnerable to the insidious decay of untreated, severe mental illness. As we step back to examine the lives of these two extraordinary women, we must prepare ourselves to hold two conflicting truths simultaneously. We must acknowledge the breathtaking beauty of the legacies they built over decades, and we must confront the absolute, terrifying darkness of the single afternoon that destroyed them both. The story of the Gala Theater is a warning, a lament, and a devastating reminder of the fragile thread that separates the light of human brilliance from the abyss of a broken mind. Let us begin to trace that thread back to its origins, to understand the towering figures involved, and to comprehend the monumental loss suffered by the world when the hammer finally fell. To comprehend the sheer magnitude of the devastation that unfolded within the walls of the Gala Theater, it is entirely necessary to first understand the towering stature of the two lives that intersected there. This was not a random collision of strangers, nor was it a mundane dispute that escalated out of ordinary circumstances. This was a catastrophic collision of two celestial bodies within the Pacific literary universe. On one side stood a foundational pillar of academic excellence, a woman who had painstakingly carved a path through the dense, often impenetrable barriers of Western institutional academia. On the other side stood a blazing, incandescent talent, an artist whose raw emotional power had forced the global literary establishment to turn its gaze toward the islands of Samoa. Together, they represented the intellectual and artistic pinnacle of their culture. They were the roots that anchored the tree and the brilliant blossoms that adorned its branches, bound together by a profound and complex relationship that transcended simple friendship. At the center of this narrative, and ultimately at the heart of its tragedy, is Dr. Caroline Sinaviana Gabbard. At 77 years old, she was far more than just a retired educator living out her golden years. She was a living legend, an institution unto herself, and a pioneering figure whose influence rippled across oceans and generations. Her life was a testament to quiet, unyielding perseverance. In an academic landscape that was, for decades, overwhelmingly dominated by Western perspectives and male voices, Caroline achieved something entirely unprecedented. She became the very first woman of Samoan descent to achieve the rank of a full professor at a university in the United States, securing this historic tenure at the prestigious University of Hawaii at Manoa. This was not merely a personal career milestone, it was a monumental victory for an entire culture. It signaled to young Polynesian women everywhere that the highest echelons of intellectual authority were not closed to them, that their voices, their histories, and their indigenous knowledge systems were worthy of the highest academic validation. Her influence, however, extended far beyond the lecture halls and administrative offices of the university. Caroline was deeply woven into a prominent family tapestry that straddled the line between cultural preservation and high-stakes American politics. She was the sister of Mike Gabbard, a well-known and highly visible political figure in the United States, and she was the aunt of former United States Congresswoman and presidential candidate Tulsi Gabbard. This familial connection placed her within a unique nexus of power and public awareness. While her relatives navigated the turbulent and often aggressive waters of national politics, Caroline chose a different kind of battlefield. Her arena was the mind, her weapons were words, research, and pedagogy, and her ultimate goal was the elevation of her people through education and literature. Despite her proximity to significant political influence, she remained a profoundly grounded individual, known universally for her immense wisdom, her unwavering calm, and her deeply nurturing spirit. To those who had the privilege of sitting in her classrooms or seeking her counsel, Caroline was the ultimate archetype of the wise elder. The archival materials, the testimonies of her peers, and the memories of her countless students all paint a consistent portrait of a woman who possessed a rare, almost gravitational serenity. She was the calm at the center of the storm, the steady hand guiding a ship through treacherous waters. More than just a professor, she was the foundational architect for a new generation of Pacific writers. She recognized that raw talent alone was rarely enough to survive the harsh realities of the publishing world or the rigorous demands of academia. Therefore, she took on the heavy, crucial role of a mentor and a protector. She actively sought out young, marginalized voices, providing them with the structural support, the academic framework, and the emotional encouragement they desperately needed to flourish. She built the stage upon which others could stand and shine. And no one shone brighter or possessed a more electrifying talent than Papaliai Sia Figiel. If Caroline was the steady, nurturing earth, Sia was the wild, unpredictable, and brilliantly illuminating fire. At 57 years old, Sia had long established herself as the undisputed star of Samoan literature, a poet and novelist whose reputation had exploded far beyond the shores of the Pacific. Her arrival on the literary scene was not a gradual ascent. It is a sudden, seismic event that fundamentally altered the landscape of post-colonial literature. Her writing was characterized by an intense, visceral honesty, a fearless exploration of the complexities of Samoan identity, the struggles of womanhood, and the lingering scars of historical trauma. She did not write polite, easily digestible stories for a Western audience. She wrote with a fierce, unapologetic authenticity that demanded to be heard on its own terms. The undeniable brilliance of Sia's work was officially recognized on a global scale in a moment of unprecedented triumph. She shattered yet another historical ceiling by becoming the first person of Samoan descent to win the incredibly prestigious Commonwealth Writers' Prize in the late 1990s, securing the award for her groundbreaking and deeply evocative novel, Where We Once Belonged. This achievement catapulted her into the highest tiers of international literary fame. She was no longer just a local talent. She was a global ambassador for Pacific literature, carrying the immense, often crushing weight of representing an entire culture on the world stage. She was lauded, celebrated, and heavily burdened by the expectations that accompany such monumental success. It was within this context of immense talent and heavy cultural responsibility that the bond between Caroline and Sia was forged and solidified. Their relationship was a beautiful, complex symbiosis. Caroline, with her deep academic grounding and her vast experience, provided Sia with a necessary anchor. She was the trusted confidant, the intellectual sparring partner, and the maternal figure who could offer guidance without judgment. Caroline understood the terrifying pressures that Sia faced, the intense isolation that often accompanies profound artistic genius, and the heavy toll that the world demands from those who dare to speak uncomfortable truths. For decades, they were inseparable allies. They shared an unspoken understanding, a mutual dedication to the elevation of the Polynesian voice, and a deep, enduring love that resembled a sisterhood forged in the fires of shared intellectual pursuit. However, beneath the glittering surface of literary awards, international acclaim, and academic prestige, a dark and insidious shadow was slowly lengthening. The mind, for all its capacity to create breathtaking art and construct complex philosophies, is an inherently fragile organ, terribly vulnerable to chemical imbalances and deep-seated psychological fracturing. For Sia Figiel, the brilliant artist who had conquered the literary world, the internal landscape was becoming increasingly treacherous. She found herself locked in a grueling, invisible battle against a severe and deteriorating state of mental health. The crushing pressure of her status, combined with deeply rooted psychological vulnerabilities, triggered a catastrophic descent into the darkest corners of human consciousness. The clinical reality of her condition was a devastating combination of profound, paralyzing depression and a severe, unrelenting manifestation of paranoia. To understand the trajectory of this tragedy, one must attempt to grasp the absolute horror of paranoid psychosis. It is not merely a state of heightened anxiety or a fleeting feeling of suspicion. Severe paranoia is a complete, systematic dismantling of reality. It is a terrifying disease that hijacks the brain's threat detection systems, forcing the sufferer to perceive imminent, lethal danger in the most benign of circumstances. It isolates the individual behind an impenetrable wall of fear, severing their connection to logic, reason, and the comforting truth of their own history. In the grip of this illness, the world transforms into a hostile, terrifying landscape where every shadow hides a predator and every gesture of affection is misinterpreted as a prelude to a betrayal. For Sia, the genius that allowed her to weave intricate narratives and profound poetry was slowly being suffocated by a fractured internal narrative over which she had absolutely no control. The brilliant mind that had once belonged to the world was increasingly becoming a solitary confinement cell. The acclaimed author, surrounded by the physical evidence of her success, was suffocating under the weight of an invisible, crushing dread. Friends, colleagues, and the wider community began to witness the tragic unraveling of a cultural icon, watching helplessly as the vibrant, fierce poet retreated further into the agonizing labyrinth of her own deteriorating mind. It is here, in the devastating intersection of profound love and severe mental illness, that the true heartbreak of this story resides. Caroline Sinaviana Gabbard, the eternal mentor, the woman who had spent her entire life protecting and uplifting others, watched her dearest friend slipping away into the darkness. Where others might have retreated, frightened by the unpredictable and volatile nature of severe mental illness, Caroline leaned in. Her entire life's philosophy was built on the foundation of providing support when it was most desperately needed. She refused to abandon the brilliant protégé she had nurtured for decades. She saw not a monster, but a beloved friend drowning in a storm of psychological agony. Armed with a lifetime of compassion and an unwavering belief in the power of their bond, Caroline made the fateful decision to travel across the ocean, leaving the safety of her home to step directly into the center of Sia's storm. She journeyed to the Galamoana Theater with the pure, selfless intention of pulling her friend back from the brink, to work on their shared projects, and to offer the steadying hand that had always been there. She walked into the sanctuary of art, completely unaware that the illness had already rewritten the rules of their reality, transforming her ultimate act of profound love into the catalyst for an unimaginable and bloody catastrophe. The Galamoana Theater, located in the quiet village of Viveciuda, was designed to be a bastion of light, a place where the heavy curtains of colonial history were pulled back to reveal the vibrant, untamed spirit of the Pacific. By May of 2024, it had become the physical manifestation of Sia Figiel's life's work, a sanctuary that housed not only the tools of her craft, but also the memories of the artistic and intellectual journey she had shared with her mentor, Caroline Sinaviana-Gabbard. On that fateful weekend, the theater stood as a silent witness to a collision between history and tragedy. Caroline arrived in Samoa with the weight of decades of mentorship behind her, carrying the genuine, earnest hope that her presence could serve as a tether for a mind that was clearly drifting further away from reality. She had traveled across the vast blue expanse of the ocean not as a tourist, but as a guardian, determined to offer the kind of deep, patient support that had defined their relationship for so long. She stepped into the Galamoana Theater fully expecting the familiar comfort of their collaboration, perhaps even bracing for the challenges of Sia's mental health, but entirely unprepared for the complete dissolution of their shared world. The days leading up to that Sunday were marked by a suffocating, almost tangible tension. The air within the theater was thick, not with the creative energy that usually fueled their projects, but with the erratic, volatile charge of paranoid psychosis. For Sia, the theater was no longer a stage for intellectual liberation. It had become an enclosed, hostile space where every shadow, every sound, and every movement of her mentor began to take on a sinister, threatening dimension. The illness, in its cruel and calculated progression, was systematically stripping away the layers of memory and affection that had once formed the bedrock of their bond. The woman she had once called teacher, friend, and savior was being systematically erased by the encroaching shadows of delusion. What Caroline saw as an attempt at dialogue, Sia perceived as an intrusion. What Caroline intended as a gentle, guiding intervention, Sia interpreted as an orchestrated betrayal or a looming, existential threat. The tragedy lies in this absolute failure of communication, a gap so wide that it could no longer be bridged by words, logic, or even the most profound love. By the afternoon of May 26, 2024, the atmosphere inside the residence had reached a breaking point. The narrative of the events that followed remains forever shrouded in the singular, terrifying perspective of an untreated psychotic break. A conversation began, as it had thousands of times before, but this one was fundamentally different. The details of that final discussion, the specific grievances, the imagined slights, the delusional accusations, are destined to remain buried in the silence of the aftermath, for the only person who witnessed the escalation would soon follow her mentor into the abyss. It is known, however, that the intellectual exchange devolved with frightening speed. The paranoia that had been simmering within Sia reached a state of critical mass. In that moment of intense, blinding psychological crisis, the cognitive ability to recognize the humanity of her guest simply vanished. The woman who had dedicated her life to the nurturing of others was no longer recognized by her student. She was perceived as an active, lethal danger that had to be neutralized. The violence that ensued was not a prolonged struggle of wills, but a swift, horrific explosion of kinetic energy. It was an act of such raw, unadulterated brutality that it completely defied the refined, literary nature of the space in which it occurred. Within the confines of the theater, items that were once used for the creation of beauty were repurposed as weapons of destruction. A knife, perhaps once used to sharpen pencils or prepare a meal for the two women, and a hammer, likely a tool for the maintenance of the artistic space, became the instruments of a life cut short in the most devastating manner imaginable. The attack was immediate and relentless. Caroline Sinaviana-Gabbard, a woman of 77 years whose grace and intellect had shaped the course of Pacific literature, was afforded no opportunity to defend herself. The intensity of the assault was absolute, leaving the mentor with no chance to escape the trap of the very space she had come to oversee. She fell, and her life, so rich with wisdom and accomplishment, was extinguished on the floor of the Gala Theater, leaving the room in a state of chaotic, unnatural silence. The aftermath of the violence was characterized by an eerie, psychological vacuum. The perpetrator, in the immediate wake of the act, was not met with the clarity of a guilty conscience or the overwhelming weight of regret. Instead, she was plunged into the terrifying, defensive state of dissociation. The reality of what she had just done was entirely incompatible with the reality she was currently constructing within her fractured mind. She did not call for help. She did not alert the authorities. She did not seek to rectify the horror of the situation. In her disoriented, paranoid state, she fled. She left the body of her mentor inside the theater, locked the doors as if to seal away the nightmare, and walked out into the humid air of the Samoan afternoon. She sought refuge not in the clarity of truth, but in the fragile, temporary shelter of a friend's home in the village of Lodofega. For nearly 24 hours, the world continued to spin as if nothing had changed. The people of Apia went about their daily routines, the sun moved across the sky, and the silence of the Gala Theater remained unbroken. During this time, Sia lived in a state of profound, haunting suspension. She was effectively cut off from reality, caught in the throes of a psychological collapse that rendered her unable to comprehend the irreversible nature of her actions. It is impossible to imagine the internal landscape of the mind during those hours, the sheer terror of the psychosis holding its grip, or the slow, agonizing moments when the first flickers of reality might have begun to pierce through the fog. She was in a village miles away from the scene of the tragedy, yet she was entirely tethered to it by the unspeakable secret she carried. The agony of the situation was compounded by the fact that the woman who had always been her compass, her anchor, and her voice of reason was now lying silent and unresponsive in a room that had been designed for the exact opposite of such destruction. It was not until the following day, May 27th, that the illusion began to falter. The friend who had offered shelter to Sia slowly became the conduit through which the truth finally began to emerge. Through the persistent, calm, and perhaps confused questioning of those around her, the reality of the events of the previous day began to surface, filtered through the shattered lens of Sia's memory. The realization of what had occurred at the theater was not a sudden, clean light, but a slow, agonizing process of comprehension. The friend, realizing the magnitude of the situation and the irreversible nature of the tragedy that had occurred, navigated the most difficult of paths, eventually leading the distraught and mentally fragile author to face the authorities. The act of surrender was not a moment of justice served, but the beginning of a long, dark descent for everyone involved. When the news of the tragedy finally broke, it hit the community like a physical blow. The loss of Caroline Sinaviana Gabbard was felt far beyond the borders of Samoa, sending ripples of grief and disbelief through academic and literary circles in Hawaii, the United States, and across the Pacific. She was a woman who had built bridges where others saw only divides, and her death in such a violent manner felt like a betrayal of everything she stood for. For the people who knew both women, those who had watched them collaborate, those who had admired their individual achievements, and those who had seen their relationship as a model of mentorship, the news was completely incomprehensible. It was a tragedy that defied easy explanation, a collision of two lives that were meant to grow and flourish in tandem, now destroyed by the unpredictable and merciless nature of the human mind. The theater, once a symbol of hope and creative output, was now sealed as a crime scene, a place where the air was thick with the weight of lost potential and the echo of a final, violent encounter. The community was left to grapple with the horror of the event, searching for answers in the aftermath, yet finding only the chilling, empty silence of a life and a friendship that had been so cruelly and abruptly taken. The discovery of the tragedy at the Gala Theater did not lead to a swift or straightforward path toward justice. Instead, It initiated a deeply complex and grueling investigative process that sought to map the collision between a celebrated literary legacy and a catastrophic mental health crisis. Following her surrender, Papaliaisia Figiel was taken into custody, and the theater, once a vibrant hub of intellectual and artistic life, was cordoned off as a primary crime scene. The investigation that followed was tasked with the immense burden of reconstructing the events of that final afternoon, a challenge made exponentially more difficult by the fact that the primary witness and the primary perpetrator were now the same individual, trapped within the volatile and unreliable terrain of her own psyche. The investigators were not merely collecting forensic evidence, they were attempting to decipher the final, chaotic interactions between two women whose relationship had spanned decades of mutual trust and academic achievement. The initial forensic analysis of the Galamoana Theater provided a grim and sobering counterpoint to the cultural significance of the space. Investigators meticulously documented the scene, searching for evidence that could explain the rapid transition from a collaborative intellectual environment to one of extreme physical violence. The presence of multiple weapons, including the knife and the hammer, underscored the impulsive and frenzied nature of the attack. Every item within the room, the manuscripts, the books, the writing desk, now served as a silent, heartbreaking testament to the life that had been so abruptly ended. The challenge for the authorities was to establish a timeline that could account for the final hours of Professor Caroline Sinaviana Gabbard. They relied on forensic reports, physical evidence, and the testimony of those who had been in contact with either woman in the days leading up to the incident. Each piece of information had to be weighed carefully against the reality of Sia's reported state of mind, which, by all accounts, had been deteriorating for a significant period. As the legal proceedings moved into the early stages of the investigation, the nature of the charges became a subject of significant scrutiny. Initially, there were discussions and preliminary filings that categorized the act under the legal framework of manslaughter. This categorization reflected the initial, perhaps more compassionate, understanding that the violence had occurred within the context of a severe mental health crisis, without the traditional, calculated intent associated with premeditated murder. However, the legal system in Samoa, faced with the sheer brutality of the injuries sustained by the victim, felt compelled to address the gravity of the act. The physical evidence of the attack, the relentless nature of the assault, and the severity of the wounds led authorities to reassess the charge, eventually elevating it to a count of murder. This decision was a point of significant contention and immense emotional weight. It forced the community and the legal system to confront the difficult question of moral and legal culpability when the perpetrator is suffering from a condition that fundamentally alters their perception of reality. The investigation also required an exhaustive inquiry into the history of the mental health services available to Sia Figiel and whether the warning signs of her decline had been sufficiently recognized or addressed by those in her orbit. This aspect of the case was fraught with difficulty, as it required probing the intimate details of a person's life that had been private until the moment of the tragedy. Investigators had to determine if there were prior episodes of paranoia or if this specific manifestation was a sudden, acute onset triggered by the arrival of her mentor. The interviews conducted with friends, colleagues, and members of the literary community painted a picture of a brilliant mind under extreme stress, struggling with the weight of global fame and the internal isolation that had deepened over the preceding years. These testimonies were vital, yet they left behind a trail of unanswered questions about how much more could have been done to intervene before the crisis reached its inevitable, tragic conclusion. Central to the investigation was the need to understand the dynamics of the meeting on May 26th. Why had the situation escalated so quickly? What specific triggers had set off the psychotic break in that moment? The investigators were hindered by the absence of a clear account, as the only survivor was trapped in a state of confusion and deep-seated trauma. The legal team tasked with her defense was faced with the monumental challenge of proving the state of her mental health without the possibility of a direct, rational explanation from the defendant herself. The process of gathering psychiatric evaluations was essential, as these assessments would ultimately form the backbone of any potential defense. Experts were brought in to analyze the progression of her condition, the nature of the paranoia she had exhibited, and whether she had the capacity to understand the nature and quality of her actions at the time of the incident. This clinical assessment was a somber, detached process that attempted to provide medical terminology for a human experience that was, in its essence, completely overwhelming. Throughout the investigation, the public sentiment was deeply polarized and marked by a profound sense of collective mourning. There was an intense desire for clarity, a desperate need for the legal system to provide an explanation that could help them make sense of the loss of one of their most respected voices. The investigation became, in many ways, a public grieving process, where every update from the police or the court was met with renewed heartbreak. The tragedy had cast a long, dark shadow over the literary community, and the ongoing investigation served as a constant reminder of the fragility of the bonds that tied the community together. Every detail that was released, the documentation of the scene, the progression of the legal charges, the reports on the defendant's mental health, felt like another layer of grief added to the already unbearable weight of the loss. The investigative team worked under the constant pressure of a community that wanted answers, but they were also bound by the strict procedural requirements of the Samoan legal system. The process was slow and methodical, designed to ensure that every aspect of the case was thoroughly documented and examined. This necessitated a level of clinical detachment that was often at odds with the emotional reality of the tragedy. The investigators were tasked with re-entering the site of the horror multiple times, conducting interviews that reopened deep wounds for those involved, and navigating the complexities of a case that touched on issues of mental health, cultural pride, and justice. The logistical and emotional burden of the investigation was immense, and it was clear that the legal system was being pushed to its absolute limits by the unique, tragic circumstances of the crime. As the months passed and the investigation neared its conclusion, the focus shifted toward the upcoming trial. The prosecution prepared a case that focused on the irrefutable reality of the violence and the responsibility that the legal system bears for providing justice for the victim. The defense, meanwhile, prepared to present a nuanced argument centered on the severe, debilitating nature of the mental health crisis that had robbed the defendant of her agency. The courtroom was being prepared for a trial that would be historic in its scope and its implications for how Samoa handles cases of extreme mental illness. The investigation had laid the groundwork for a process that was meant to be the final, necessary step in addressing the tragedy. However, the path toward that courtroom was being paved with a sense of inevitability that was deeply troubling. The investigation had successfully documented the facts of the incident, but it had failed to provide any true, lasting comfort or closure to the families, friends, and colleagues who were left behind. The deeper the investigation delved, the more evident it became that the law could only ever provide a superficial response to a loss that was profound, complex, and ultimately beyond the reach of any human judgment. The tragedy at Vaivesuta had left an indelible mark on the landscape of Samoa, and as the investigators finished their work, they left behind a community that was forever altered, forced to live in the space between the brilliance of the past and the cold, unyielding reality of a present that was defined by a loss that could never be repaired. The case file grew thick with reports, photographs, and testimonies, but none of these documents could fill the void left by the absence of two of the most significant figures in the island's intellectual history, and the investigation stood as a monument to a failure that was both systemic and profoundly, achingly personal. The anticipation of the trial for Papali Isia Figil was, for the people of Samoa and the global literary community, a period of agonizing suspense. It was to be the final reckoning, the moment where the abstract, cold legal mechanisms of the state would attempt to process the deeply intimate and chaotic destruction that had taken place within the Galamoana Theater. As the legal preparations unfolded, the courtroom was positioned not merely as a site of judgment, but as a potential theater for the final resolution of a tragedy that had severed the heart of the nation's cultural identity. However, the legal trajectory of the case was perpetually haunted by the fundamental, irreconcilable tension between the cold facts of a homicide and the harrowing, diagnostic reality of severe, untreated mental illness. The legal system, designed to weigh intent and culpability, found itself standing before a case that challenged the very definitions of agency. The prosecution's case was built on the foundation of the physical evidence, a narrative of undeniable, brutal violence that could not be ignored. Their objective was to secure a conviction for murder, the highest charge in the Samoan legal code, reflecting the gravity of the assault on Professor Caroline Sinaviana-Gabbard. They presented a case defined by the finality of the act. A 77-year-old woman, a titan of academic achievement, had been silenced in a manner that was both swift and relentless. The prosecution argued that the law must provide a clear, unambiguous response to such an act, regardless of the perpetrator's professional stature or previous contributions to the arts. They focused on the reality of the weapons, the nature of the injuries, and the irrevocable loss sustained by the victim's family and the academic world. In their view, the courtroom was the only space where this loss could be validated and where the rule of law could assert its dominance over the chaos of the tragedy. Opposing this, the defense team was tasked with the immense responsibility of presenting a narrative that was, in its essence, a plea for the recognition of human fragility. They were not attempting to deny that the violence occurred, nor were they seeking to minimize the profound sorrow surrounding the loss of Caroline. Instead, they were preparing to introduce the clinical and psychiatric history of Sia Figiel as the primary lens through which her actions must be viewed. The defense sought to demonstrate that the paranoid psychosis, which had been developing in the shadow of her global fame, had effectively dismantled her capacity for rational thought and moral judgment. They prepared to bring forth evidence of her deteriorating mental state, the documented patterns of her paranoia, and the consensus of psychiatric experts who could explain the mechanics of a break so complete that the victim had been perceived as an active, lethal threat. For the defense, the trial was not about punishment, but about the profound, systemic failure of the medical and social support systems that should have caught an artist who was clearly falling. The atmosphere in the lead-up to the proceedings was characterized by a heavy, palpable unease. The public galleries were expected to be filled with individuals who felt the weight of both lives, those who mourned the loss of a mentor, and those who felt the tragic collapse of a brilliant, albeit broken, protégé. The courtroom was to be a space where two, largely conflicting realities would collide: the moral requirement for justice and the medical reality of severe mental illness. As the scheduled date for the proceedings drew closer, the anticipation of the arguments, the cross-examinations, and the final delivery of a verdict felt like a storm gathering over the capital of Apia. There were deep divisions in the community about how to interpret the actions of the defendant. For some, her literary genius did not offer a veil of protection against the consequences of such a violent act, while for others, the tragedy was a clear indictment of a society that failed to recognize the cries of a mind caught in the grip of such a terrifying, isolating disease. The legal process, however, was fundamentally altered by the physical and mental state of the defendant herself. Throughout her period of remand at the Tanyamalala prison, Sia Figiel was under constant supervision, and the reports regarding her psychological health became increasingly dire. She was a woman who had, in the wake of her psychotic break, been forced to navigate a slow, agonizing return to a reality that she was no longer capable of inhabiting. The realization of what she had done, once the clouds of her delusions had begun to clear, was not a step toward reconciliation or repentance. It was a devastating, crushing awareness of the horror of her own actions. The psychological torment of living with the knowledge that she had destroyed her most precious relationship became a prison within a prison. The trial was designed to force her to confront these actions in a public arena, a scenario that seemed to exacerbate the very trauma that the medical system was trying and failing to address. The courtroom proceedings were destined to be a reflection of the nation's struggle to reconcile its traditional values with the modern legal complexities of a high-profile homicide involving mental health. The presence of the victim's family, the international attention from academic circles, and the sheer cultural weight of the two individuals involved meant that the trial would inevitably be a landmark event. Every move by the prosecution and the defense was scrutinized for its implications on future cases, and the legal teams were keenly aware of the pressure to provide a verdict that was seen as both legally sound and morally resonant. The judge was faced with the unenviable task of balancing the rigid requirements of the penal code against the compassionate, but complex, arguments regarding the defendant's mental capacity. It was a scenario where the law was being asked to do something it was rarely designed for, to provide a nuanced understanding of a human life that had shattered in a way that defied easy explanation. Ultimately, the courtroom remained a silent, empty stage for a drama that was never permitted to unfold. The legal apparatus had done its work. The charges were filed, the evidence was gathered, and the experts were prepared. But the resolution that the community sought, the catharsis of a public trial and the closure of a formal verdict, was denied by the cruel logic of the tragedy itself. The case file, which had been meticulously compiled, was destined to remain an incomplete document. The trial had been intended to address the question of who was to be held responsible for the destruction of a life, but it ended up pointing toward the much darker, more uncomfortable realization that the tragedy was a systemic rupture that occurred beyond the reach of any judge, jury, or prosecutor. The courtroom, meant to be the theater of justice, instead became a monument to the inadequacy of legal processes when faced with the absolute, unpredictable, and terrifying depths of human psychological destruction. The legal narrative, while essential for the documentation of the crime, failed to capture the profound, echoing silence that now defined the aftermath. The trial was destined to be a memory of what could have happened, a ghost of a proceeding that would never provide the final, satisfying conclusion that the nation and the families so desperately needed. As the legal proceedings ground to a permanent halt, the questions that the trial was supposed to answer remained unanswered, suspended in the air like the humidity of the Samoan afternoon. The justice system, in its formal capacity, had done what it could, but it was left to the public, the families, and the communities to continue living with the reality of a loss that no sentencing, no verdict, and no cross-examination could ever truly mitigate. The stage was set, the arguments were drafted, but the actors were gone, and the audience was left to contemplate an ending that had been written by the slow, grinding machinery of a mind under siege, long before the first gavel was ever struck in the halls of the judiciary. The final act of this tragedy did not take place in the ornate wooden chambers of the Samoan judiciary, nor did it find resolution in the balanced scales of a jury's verdict. It occurred within the cold, industrial confines of the Tanyamala prison, a place where the state's duty to contain and regulate culminated in a silence more profound than any courtroom could ever produce. In January 2026, the life of Papaliai Sia came to a definitive, self-inflicted end, a chilling punctuation mark on a story that had already been defined by an unthinkable loss. Her death was not merely the suicide of a prisoner, it was the final, devastating collapse of a brilliant mind that could no longer reconcile its own existence with the horrific reality of what it had wrought. This second death effectively stripped away any remaining hope for the kind of public reckoning that the community so fervently desired, leaving behind a void where answers should have been, and a legacy that will forever be stained by the events of that May afternoon. The aftermath of this double tragedy, the loss of a legendary mentor and the self-destruction of her iconic protege, left the Pacific literary community and the broader academic world in a state of profound, disoriented mourning. The ripple effects of this event were not confined to the physical boundaries of Samoa. They extended across the ocean, touching everyone who had ever studied the work of either woman or been shaped by their intellectual contributions. People who had long looked to Caroline Sinaviana-Gabbard as a source of wisdom and to Sia Figiel as a font of artistic inspiration were suddenly forced to grapple with the reality that these two figures, who had seemed to stand above the mundane struggles of life, were as vulnerable to the darkness of the human condition as anyone else. It was a confrontation with the fragility of genius, a brutal reminder that the capacity to create, to analyze, and to uplift does not provide an exemption from the unpredictable decay of the mind. The loss of Professor Caroline Sinaviana-Gabbard was, in its own right, a monumental event that left an unfillable hole in the field of Polynesian studies and beyond. Her death was not just the passing of an educator, it was the disappearance of a lighthouse that had guided generations of students through the turbulent waters of academia. Her influence was foundational, and the tragedy of her passing was deepened by the intimate, protective nature of the act she had been performing. She had died in the service of compassion, her final gesture being one of mentorship and love toward a person who had lost her way. This realization was perhaps the most agonizing part of the grief process for those who had known her. To have her life cut short by the very person she had championed was an irony so sharp and so cruel that it seemed almost beyond the capacity of the human heart to accept. The academic world was left to memorialize a woman who had, until her final breath, been the personification of intellectual grace and maternal protection. For the cultural identity of Samoa, the case of the Galamoana Theater became a heavy, permanent shadow. It forced the society to look inward, to confront the limitations of its support systems, and to acknowledge the immense, often invisible pressures that its most prominent figures face. The story of Figiel's struggle and eventual collapse served as an indictment of a societal framework that failed to adequately identify and address the warning signs of a mental health crisis that was, in hindsight, visible to those in her close circle. The tragedy sparked uncomfortable conversations about the responsibility of the community toward its artists, the role of mental health services in a culture that often prizes stoicism, and the ethical implications of allowing such a severe condition to fester until it reached a point of catastrophic violence. The nation was left to navigate the difficult process of honoring the brilliance of its fallen icons while simultaneously coming to terms with the darkness that had led to their destruction. As time moves forward, the story of this tragedy will likely continue to evolve in the collective memory of the region. It will be discussed in literary seminars as a cautionary tale about the burdens of genius and the isolation of the artistic life. It will be referenced in psychiatric discourses as a stark example of the potential for severe paranoid psychosis to manifest in total, lethal destruction. Yet, for those who are closest to the two women, the tragedy will always remain something far more personal and far more painful than any historical or clinical analysis can capture. It is the loss of a mentor's warmth, the loss of an artist's voice, and the loss of a friendship that had once seemed unbreakable. The silence that now hangs over the Galamoana Theater is a constant, haunting reminder of the cost of that loss, a space where the echoes of what could have been still linger in the humid Pacific air. The aftermath also brought with it a shift in how the community perceives the intersection of public achievement and private struggle. There is now a greater, perhaps more sobering, awareness of the vulnerability that often lies beneath the surface of those who represent their culture on the global stage. The tragedy has prompted a renewed emphasis on the necessity of holistic support, on the need for structures that can provide real, effective help when the burdens of life become unsustainable. It has also fostered a more nuanced, albeit painful, understanding of the complexities of mental illness, moving away from the easy, reductive narratives of the past toward a more compassionate acknowledgement of the sheer, terrifying power that a fractured mind can possess. The legacy of both women is now being reframed, not just through the lens of their accomplishments, but also through the lens of their shared, tragic end, which serves as a testament to the fact that greatness does not immunize against the deepest of human agonies. Ultimately, the tragedy of May 2024 stands as a profound, indelible mark on the landscape of Pacific history. It is a story that defies the conventional structure of a true crime narrative, refusing to offer the easy resolution of a courtroom verdict or the comfort of a definitive explanation. It is a story that demands the listener to hold the brilliance and the horror together, to acknowledge the weight of the loss while confronting the terrifying nature of the cause. The silence that followed the death of Sia Figiel in January 2026 was the final, inevitable conclusion to a process of destruction that had begun months before. It left behind no one to account for the actions, no one to offer an explanation, and no one to provide the finality that the public craved. It left only the cold, unyielding reality of a tragedy that was complete, total, and irreversible. We are left with the task of remembering both women, not just for the ways in which they died, but for the ways in which they lived, for the thousands of pages they wrote, the lectures they delivered, the lives they touched, and the cultural landscape they fundamentally changed. The Galamoana Theater, now silent and empty, will remain a symbol of the immense potential that was lost and the terrifying fragility of the bonds that connect us all. As the waves continue to crash against the shores of Samoa, as they have for millennia, they carry with them the weight of this story, a narrative that will continue to echo through the halls of history as a testament to the complexities of the human spirit, the vulnerability of the human mind, and the devastating, irreversible cost of a loss that hit the very heart of a nation. The tragedy, in its final, silent form, serves as a permanent, haunting reminder of the thin, precarious line that separates the light of human achievement from the darkness of an abyss from which there is no return. There are no more words to add to the account, no more evidence to collect, no more witnesses to hear. There is only the ongoing, collective process of living in the wake of an event that shattered everything it touched, leaving us all to contemplate the silence that remains in the path of a storm that has long since passed. The memory of the mentor and the artist will persist, as will the collective grief of a nation, for such a loss is not easily erased, nor is the lesson it imparts easily ignored. In the end, the most profound takeaway from this entire, heartbreaking saga is the realization of the absolute, inescapable necessity for empathy, for vigilance, and for a deeper, more committed understanding of the fragility that defines us all, as individuals and as a community, standing together against the encroaching shadows of a world that can, at any moment, change into something unrecognizable and cruel. The story ends here, not with the gavel of a judge, but with the quiet, persistent truth of the lives that were lived and the lives that were so abruptly and so tragically surrendered. The closing of a case file by the judicial and penal authorities of a nation signifies the end of a legal process, but it rarely marks the true conclusion of the human tragedy that necessitated its creation. When the legal machinery grinds to a final, abrupt halt, as it did in the early days of 2026 within the walls of the Tanyamulala prison, it leaves behind a narrative landscape that is fractured, unfinished, and profoundly quiet. For the global community of writers, scholars, and historians who had watched the unfolding horror of the Vive Suda case with a mixture of disbelief and deep sorrow, the death of Papaliai Sia did not provide answers or closure. Instead, it locked the final doors on an archive of human suffering, ensuring that the precise mechanisms of the psychological collapse that destroyed two of the Pacific's brightest intellectual lights would remain forever obscured. We are left in the aftermath not with a neat moral resolution, but with a complex, haunting meditation on the relationship between creative genius, institutional isolation, and the devastating power of untreated mental illness. To look back at the entirety of this narrative is to confront the terrifying reality of how quickly a life's work can be overshadowed by a single afternoon of unmitigated crisis. The physical space of the Galamoana Theatre, which had been envisioned as a sacred storehouse for the indigenous narratives of Polynesia, stands today as a silent monument to this exact vulnerability. The manuscripts that sit upon its shelves, the drafts of poetry that were meant to challenge the lingering structures of post-colonial thought, and the historical records compiled over decades are now irrevocably bound to the memory of a violent catastrophe. This is the enduring curse of the tragedy. The creative output of both the mentor and the student can no longer be evaluated in isolation from the blood that was spilled on that living room floor. For future generations of students and researchers who approach the work of Dr. Caroline Sinaviana-Gabbard or the novels of Sia Figiel, their initial encounter will always be filtered through the dark, heavy prism of the events of May 2024. The ink on the page remains permanent, but its meaning has been fundamentally and permanently rewritten by the violence of the hammer and the knife. This structural transformation of legacy is particularly acute when one considers the thematic core of Sia Figiel's most celebrated work, her award-winning novel whose title now carries a weight that is almost too heavy to bear. When she wrote about the spaces where her characters once belonged, she was exploring the delicate, often painful process of navigating identity within a rapidly changing cultural landscape. In the wake of her own self-destruction and the murder of her mentor, that phrase transforms from a poignant literary exploration into a literal, tragic description of displacement. Both women now belong to a past that is defined by what was lost rather than what was achieved. The brilliant, fiery novelist who forced the international literary establishment to recognize the raw power of the Samoan voice, is no longer remembered solely as a trailblazer. She is remembered as a person who, in the grip of a profound and terrifying paranoia, destroyed the very foundation upon which her career was built. The tragedy lies in this absolute inversion of purpose, a cruel irony where the hands that were meant to preserve and articulate the soul of a culture became the instruments of its deepest wounding. The void left by the passing of Dr. Caroline Sinaviana Gabbard is equally vast and perhaps even more difficult for the academic community to reconcile. As the first Samoan woman to achieve the rank of full professor at a major American university, her life was a masterclass in structural endurance and intellectual generosity. She was a scholar who did not merely occupy space within the elite tiers of academia. She actively used her position to construct bridges for those who were traditionally excluded from those spaces. Her methodology was built on the principle of protective mentorship, a belief that the preservation of indigenous knowledge required the fierce, unyielding defense of the young minds tasked with carrying it forward. That she met her end while actively executing this philosophy, traveling across an ocean to offer a lifeline to a student who had lost her way, is a detail that elevates her passing from a conventional loss into a profound, generational trauma. The institutional memory of the University of Hawaii at Manoa and the wider Pacific Studies Network remains deeply scarred by the realization that her final act of profound love was met with such catastrophic violence. The systemic implications of the Vives Yuta tragedy extend far beyond the personal grief of the families or the professional loss of the academic community. It forces a radical and uncomfortable reevaluation of how society monitors and supports the mental health of its most high-achieving individuals. For decades, the global cultural narrative has maintained a dangerous, romanticized fascination with the concept of the tormented artist, the isolated genius whose creative brilliance is somehow tied to their psychological suffering. The devastating reality of Sia Figueil's collapse completely dismantles this myth, showing that severe mental illness is not a source of creative inspiration, but an aggressive, degenerative disease that destroys the capacity for relationship, logic, and survival. The fact that an individual of her stature, surrounded by international acclaim and connected to extensive networks of professional support, could deteriorate into a state of paranoid psychosis without an effective intervention occurring is a sobering reminder of the invisible walls that isolate those who suffer from deep psychological trauma. It exposes the profound inadequacy of a cultural framework that praises the public output of an artist while remaining blind or indifferent to the quiet, systematic unraveling of their private mind. As the geographic landscape of Samoa continues its slow, eternal rhythm, the villages of Vives Yuta and Lotofega carry the memory of these events within their historical fabric. In small island nations, where the networks of kinship are dense and deeply interconnected, a tragedy of this magnitude does not fade quickly from the public consciousness. It becomes a part of the local lore, a somber story told in whispers beneath the canopy of the trees, a marker of a time when the cultural equilibrium was profoundly disrupted. The community is left to navigate the delicate process of collective healing without the benefit of a formal legal resolution, forced to find their own ways to balance the immense respect they hold for the legacy of the victims with the horror of the act that claimed them. The silence of the South Pacific, which can seem so peaceful to the casual observer, remains charged with the unresolved tension of this double loss, an enduring reminder that the deep waters of the ocean are mirrored by the equally profound and unpredictable depths of human consciousness. The public legacy of the case is also uniquely complicated by the prominent political lineages involved, particularly the connection to the Gabbard family in the United States. For a family accustomed to the intense, adversarial scrutiny of national politics, the murder of Caroline introduced a dimension of grief that was entirely removed from the arena of policy and public debate. It was an intimate, devastating tragedy that thrust their private sorrow into the international spotlight, forcing them to mourn a beloved sister and aunt while the media dissected the horrific details of her final moments. The intersection of this high-profile political family with the cultural elite of Samoa ensured that the case would command a level of global attention that is rare for incidents occurring within the independent nation of Samoa. Yet, despite the noise of the international press and the complex political context surrounding the family, the core of the story remained stubbornly, devastatingly personal. An elderly woman of immense wisdom had been taken from the world by a friend she had gone to save. Ultimately, the true permanence of this story is found in the archival record that remains long after the voices of the participants have been silenced. When future researchers look back at the cultural history of the Pacific in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, they will find the names of Caroline Sinaviana-Gabbard and Sia Figil permanently intertwined, not just as collaborators on the page, but as casualties of a shared, catastrophic psychological storm. The finality of the events of January 2026 ensures that there will be no late-career redemption, no final interviews explaining the unexplainable, and no memoirs written from the quiet reflection of a prison cell. The narrative is closed, sealed by the same heavy hand that brought the hammer down in the theater. We are left as observers to contemplate the fragile boundary that separates human brilliance from absolute destruction, to understand that the mind capable of constructing the most beautiful expressions of our shared humanity is the very same organ that can, when broken by illness, tear that humanity apart. The podcast must end here, not with a clean resolution of a sentence passed, but with the haunting, echoic understanding that some tragedies are so profound that they defy the architecture of justice entirely, leaving us to simply stand in the quiet aftermath of a loss that can never be repaired. The final reflection upon this harrowing sequence of events requires us to step back from the specific details of the crime scene and the legal collapse, and instead, contemplate the enduring, ghostly presence of the Gala Moana Theater itself. Buildings, in the context of human memory, often become the vessel for the traumas that occur within their walls, their architecture absorbing the weight of the actions that once transpired there. For the village of Vaivesuda, the theater is no longer merely a structure of wood and iron. It is a repository of an unspooling nightmare, a place where the air itself seems to hang heavy with the memory of a bond severed. The silence that now pervades that space is not the silence of peace, but the silence of an abandoned sanctuary, a testament to the fact that when an act of such intimate and brutal violence occurs, the physical space itself becomes irrevocably tainted. It stands as a monument to the failure of the protective structures that we assume exist around our most cherished and brilliant citizens, a physical reminder that greatness is no shield against the encroaching darkness of the mind. We must also consider the profound ripple effects that this tragedy has exerted upon the collective psyche of the Polynesian intellectual community. The loss of two such towering figures, in a manner so sudden and so inherently contradictory to their life's work, has created a permanent fissure in the narrative of Pacific literature. For many young writers who looked up to the collaborative relationship between Caroline and Sia as a blueprint for their own professional and artistic journeys, the destruction of that relationship was a foundational trauma. It challenged the assumption that intellectual mentorship is a fundamentally safe and nurturing endeavor, forcing a difficult conversation about the boundaries between personal support and psychological intervention. The legacy of the mentorship they modeled is now forever burdened by the reality of how it ended, leaving a new generation of Pacific thinkers to wonder how to hold onto the ideals of community and artistic support when the most prominent examples of such bonds have met with a conclusion so unimaginably grim. The broader implications for mental health awareness in the region cannot be overstated, yet they remain complicated by the deeply ingrained cultural patterns that prioritize community harmony and stoic endurance over the vulnerability of seeking professional help. In many Pacific cultures, the appearance of stability is often equated with the health of the community itself, and individuals who are perceived as cultural ambassadors or intellectual leaders are often expected to embody that stability, regardless of the internal battles they may be fighting. The case of Papaliai Sia Figil serves as a brutal, necessary catalyst for the questioning of these norms, highlighting the lethal cost of allowing artistic brilliance to excuse the deterioration of mental well-being. The tragedy has sparked a painful, ongoing dialogue about the necessity of destigmatizing psychiatric care, and ensuring that those who carry the heavy weight of cultural representation are given access to the same depth of support as the populations they represent. It is a slow, agonizing process of transition, but it is one that is being driven by the haunting memory of the brilliance that was lost to the shadows. Furthermore, we must address the enduring, unanswerable questions that persist long after the legal and investigative files have been closed. We will never fully know the extent of the internal reality that Sia Figil constructed in the months leading up to that Sunday in May 2024. We will never know the specific, idiosyncratic delusions that she harbored, nor the way she processed the presence of the woman who had served as her anchor for so many years. The absence of a trial means that these psychological details, which could have offered a modicum of clarity to the community, have been permanently erased. This lack of resolution creates a vacuum that is, in many ways, more damaging than the truth itself, as it allows for the proliferation of speculation, myth, and the inevitable and often unfair revisionism of their histories. We are forced to live with a narrative that is permanently incomplete, a story with a gaping, dark hole at its center that no amount of analysis or retrospection can ever hope to fill. In contemplating the character of Dr. Caroline Sinaviana-Gabbard, we are reminded of the inherent, fragile nature of the humanitarian impulse. She was a woman who lived her life with the explicit intent of being a catalyst for the growth of others, a goal that required an enormous investment of emotional, intellectual, and temporal resources. Her death was the ultimate, albeit tragic, expression of this commitment. She had not chosen the safety of her home, but the vulnerability of the field. This choice, while catastrophic in its outcome, is the very element of her legacy that will continue to inspire those who value the work of service and education. The challenge for those who honor her memory is to decouple her death from the quality of her life, to recognize that her commitment to her protégé was not a mistake, but a manifestation of the very values that made her such a pioneering and revered figure in the first place. Her life was a testament to the belief that the barriers we face, whether colonial, institutional, or psychological, can only be overcome through the persistent, compassionate labor of the individual. As for the memory of Sia Figil, it is currently caught in a difficult, uncomfortable transition from the remembrance of her artistic triumphs to the recognition of her final, destructive act. This is the burden of the public figure who falls from such a height. The magnitude of their contribution is forever weighed against the gravity of their crime. Her novels and poems will remain, and they will continue to be read, but they will be read by a public that now knows the harrowing secret of their author's end. This is not necessarily a failure of her work, but it is a fundamental shift in the context of its reception. The brilliance that she brought to the world is now inseparable from the horror she inflicted, a duality that future scholars and readers will have to navigate with patience and, hopefully, a degree of empathy. The work remains, but it now sits in the shadow of the theater, a silent partner to the tragedy that transformed a celebrated voice into the subject of a still unfolding, cautionary tale. The closing reflection must return to the silence that characterizes the entire event. The silence of the Galamoana Theater, the silence of the prison cell where the life of the perpetrator ended, the silence of a community that is still processing the enormity of its loss, and the silence of the records that now contain the history of these two lives. This silence is the true conclusion of the story, an expansive and empty space that replaces the vibrant, intellectual dialogue that once defined the friendship between the mentor and the student. It is a silence that invites us to pause, to breathe, and to consider the terrifying fragility of our own minds and the equally precarious nature of the bonds that define us. We are reminded, once again, that history is not just the record of the great things we achieve, but also the record of the profound, tragic, and irreversible losses we suffer along the way. The story of Caroline and Sia is a permanent marker in the history of the Pacific, a moment where the light of immense talent was extinguished by the sudden, overwhelming onset of internal darkness. As we conclude this exploration, we must acknowledge that we have not provided a solution, for there is none. We have not provided a justification, for the act remains indefensible. We have merely laid out the facts of a devastating collapse, hoping that in the mere act of witnessing, we might find some small measure of honoring for the woman who lost her life in the service of compassion, and perhaps a degree of understanding for the woman who, in her final illness, lost her way entirely. The story remains open, in the sense that its lessons are still being processed by a nation and a community, but it is also closed, in the sense that the participants are gone, and their final chapters have been written in the most irreversible of ways. The South Pacific, with its vast, uncaring ocean and its eternal, rhythmic tides, continues to hold the memory of these two women, forever locked in the complex, tragic embrace of their shared past, and forever separated by the single, violent, and utterly senseless afternoon in May 2024. The podcast fades, but the memory remains, etched into the cultural landscape, an indelible testament to the cost of our shared humanity and the profound, and often hidden, vulnerabilities that lie within the heart of even the most luminous of lives. This is the conclusion of our narrative. It is a story that refuses to be silenced, yet offers no comfort, standing instead as a stark, enduring mirror of the darker realities of the human condition. The final, lingering echoes of this tragedy resonate not in the halls of justice, nor in the sterile reports of forensic pathology, but in the enduring, quiet spaces where those who loved and admired these two remarkable women must now dwell. The narrative of the Galamoana Theater has reached its natural, somber conclusion, yet the questions it poses remain suspended in the air like the humid atmosphere of the Apia capital. We are left to navigate the uncomfortable terrain between the immense, light-filled accomplishments of their pasts and the absolute, suffocating darkness that ultimately consumed their shared reality. This exploration has been a journey through the architecture of a collapse, a systematic dissection of how a profound intellectual and personal bond, nurtured over decades, was dismantled by the relentless, invisible erosion of a severe mental health crisis. We have observed the mentor, a pillar of academic excellence, and the protege, a blazing star of the literary firmament, and we have witnessed the tragic intersection where their paths diverged into chaos and ruin. To truly understand the weight of this loss, one must move beyond the shock of the violent encounter and consider the profound, generational impact of losing voices that had become essential to the cultural lexicon of the Pacific. Dr. Caroline Sinaviana Gabbard was not just an individual. She was an embodiment of a movement toward Indigenous reclamation in the Academy. Her existence, her teaching, and her advocacy were all part of a larger project of healing the historical scars of colonialism through the restoration of intellectual sovereignty. When she was silenced, the community did not just lose a person, they lost a repository of knowledge, a guardian of ancestral narratives, and a bridge builder who had spent her entire existence ensuring that the voices of the future would be louder, clearer, and more authoritative than the voices of the past. Her death is a permanent subtraction from the intellectual capital of the entire region, a hole that can never be adequately filled by the efforts of those who remain. Similarly, the self-destruction of Papaliai Sia Figil represents the annihilation of a voice that had fundamentally transformed the way the world engaged with the Samoan experience. Her work was a radical act of visibility, a demand for the global literary stage to acknowledge the visceral, complex, and deeply human realities of Pacific life. By choosing the path of self-annihilation within the confines of her prison cell, she finalized the tragedy of her own decline, ensuring that the brilliant, rebellious spirit that had once captivated the world would be forever associated with the act of betrayal. This is a burden that the literary community will have to carry for generations. They are tasked with the delicate, impossible work of separating the profound artistic achievements that Sia bestowed upon the world from the horrific reality of the paranoia that eventually dismantled her mind. It is a necessary project, one that requires a deep, uncompromising empathy, yet it remains a task fraught with the constant, haunting reminder of the lives that were surrendered to the tragedy of May 2024. As we look toward the future, the lessons extracted from this double heartbreak must transcend the simple, binary categorization of victim and perpetrator. We are presented with a far more difficult and essential challenge: to develop a more robust, compassionate, and vigilant system of care that acknowledges the extreme psychological pressures inherent in the life of the creative genius. The tragedy at Vive Ciudad is a stark, unavoidable indictment of a culture that celebrates the output of the artist while remaining largely indifferent to the internal, systematic decay that often accompanies the artistic life. It serves as an urgent reminder that mental health is not a private, secondary concern, but a foundational requirement for the sustainability of a healthy society. If the community is to honor the legacies of Caroline and Sia, it must do so by transforming the systems that failed them, ensuring that the next generation of Pacific thinkers and artists is not left to struggle in isolation against the creeping, lethal shadows of untreated mental illness. The role of community and the importance of professional intervention have emerged as the central pillars of the discourse surrounding this case. The story highlights the devastating consequences of relying on the informal, familial support structures that, while deeply rooted in Polynesian tradition, proved entirely insufficient against the objective, clinical reality of severe psychosis. The failure was not a lack of love, nor was it a lack of commitment. It was a failure of capability. The intensity of the paranoia, the speed of the cognitive deterioration, and the totalizing nature of the psychotic break were forces that demanded a level of medical expertise and systematic support that the traditional model could not provide. This realization is painful, yet it is essential for the future protection of the community's most brilliant and vulnerable minds. The shift toward a more integrated, medically informed model of care must be the primary, tangible outcome of this collective, enduring grief. As the years continue to unfold, the memory of these two women will likely transition from the realm of active, current trauma into the domain of historical memory. They will be remembered in the lecture halls of universities, the pages of literary journals, and the conversations of those who carry the burden of their legacy forward. They will be remembered as the woman who broke the barriers of the academy and the woman who shattered the expectations of the literary world. And they will be remembered for the single, violent afternoon that brought them together in a tragic, final collision. This dual reality, the glory of their achievements and the horror of their ending, is the permanent burden of their shared history. It is a history that does not offer the comfort of closure, but demands the constant, active engagement of those who strive to understand the human condition in all its complexity, its beauty, its capacity for creation, and its terrifying, inherent potential for destruction. In these final moments, we reflect on the silence that now defines the Galamoana Theater, a silence that is more resonant than any words we could summon. It is a silence that invites us to honor the life of the mentor and to acknowledge the profound, crushing weight of the illness that took the student. It is a silence that serves as a barrier, preventing us from ever truly entering the reality of that afternoon, yet it also serves as a bridge, connecting our collective grief to the shared, fundamental vulnerability that defines us all as human beings. We walk away from this narrative with a heightened awareness of the fragility of our connections and the vital importance of the vigilance with which we must guard one another. The tragedy at Vive Ciudad was an event that could not be prevented, given the circumstances of the time, yet it is an event that must never be repeated, provided we have the courage to learn, to grow, and to fundamentally change how we support those who carry the heavy, luminous, and often solitary weight of genius. The journey we have taken through the events of 2024 and 2026 has been an attempt to document, to analyze, and to honor. It has been a process of weaving together the fragments of a story that is, by its very nature, shattered. We have sought to find meaning in the chaos, to find structure in the void, and to provide a space for the recognition of two lives that were defined by their immense, singular potential. As the story concludes, we are left with the realization that the most powerful, and perhaps the most difficult, thing we can do is to hold the memory of these two women with both hands, to remember the brilliance, the mentorship, and the art, while also acknowledging the darkness, the violence, and the loss. This is the ultimate, necessary act of remembrance. It is a refusal to simplify, a refusal to forget, and a refusal to allow the silence of the theater to swallow the reality of their existence. The podcast fades, But the stories of Caroline Sinaviana Gabbard and Papali Sia Figil will persist, etched forever into the historical and cultural landscape of the Pacific, standing as a permanent, haunting testament to the tragedy of a bond that was born in beauty and ended in the darkness of an unanswerable, irreversible, and profoundly human nightmare. The final, soft echo of their names lingers in the quiet air, a reminder of the two lives that were once here and the void that they have left behind, a void that will continue to shape, to challenge, and to inform the consciousness of all who encounter their story. We conclude this journey not with an answer, but with a respectful, enduring acknowledgement of the complexity of the lives lost and the profound and permanent tragedy of their ending, leaving the final, heavy weight of the story to rest in the shared, collective memory of the people they served, the art they created, and the world they forever changed. The finality of the tragedy at the Galamoana Theater is a weight that does not lift, a burden that remains suspended in the cultural consciousness of the Pacific long after the headlines have faded and the legal archives have been shuttered. To reach the 10th and final reflection on this harrowing sequence of events is to recognize that the story of Caroline Sinaviana Gabbard and Papali Sia Figil is not a closed book, but a lingering presence that informs the future. It is a story that has fundamentally altered the way the intellectual and literary communities of the region perceive their own vulnerabilities, forcing an uncomfortable but necessary shift from a culture of stoic, isolated brilliance toward one of communal responsibility and psychological vigilance. We are left to contemplate not just the individual losses of two icons, but the collective loss of the potential future they represented, a future where mentorship, art, and intellectual rigor were meant to be the engines of cultural flourishing. When we consider the totality of this, we must grapple with the absolute, uncompromising nature of the void that has been created. The mentor is gone, and with her, the wisdom and protective guidance that she offered to so many. The protege is gone, and with her, the raw, incandescent talent that had once redefined the possibilities for Pacific literature. The theater, the physical vessel for their collaborative spirit, remains in a state of stasis, a shell that once housed the creative energy of two brilliant women and now serves as an empty, silent monument to the fragility of that very energy. This void is not merely a personal or familial grievance. It is a cultural deficit, a hole in the fabric of the region's identity that will require decades of collective effort to even begin to address. We are left to wonder what manuscripts remained unwritten, what students went unguided, and what conversations remained unfinished when the hammer fell. The lessons that must be drawn from this are not found in the courtroom or the crime lab, but in the everyday practices of our intellectual and artistic institutions. The most vital takeaway is the urgent, non-negotiable requirement for the deconstruction of the myth of the isolated artist. We have seen, with the most painful clarity, that brilliance does not provide a sanctuary from the physiological and psychological realities of severe mental health decay. To continue to romanticize the struggle of the individual, to expect our cultural icons to carry the weight of representation in isolation, and to fail to provide the rigorous, professional support systems that are necessary to maintain mental equilibrium, is to be complicit in the next potential catastrophe. The culture of the Pacific, and indeed any community that values the life of the mind, must move toward an integrated model of care that prioritizes the humanity of the creator over the output of their art. This transformation requires a radical shift in how we interact with one another, particularly within the hierarchies of academia and the arts. The role of the mentor, as Caroline so perfectly embodied, is inherently protective, yet it cannot be expected to function as a clinical or psychiatric safety net. The mentor's mandate is to nurture the intellect and the talent, but the responsibility for mental health must be shared by the institution, the community, and the professional medical establishment. We must build infrastructures of support that are both visible and accessible, ensuring that when an individual begins to show the early, subtle signs of psychological unraveling, there is a clear, institutional pathway to professional intervention. This is not about surveillance or restriction. It is about the practical expression of care, ensuring that those who contribute the most to the enrichment of our shared culture are not left to perish in the shadows of their own internal struggles. The legacy of the Galamoana Theater will continue to exert a powerful, sobering influence on the regional discourse. It serves as an indelible marker of the year 2024, a time when the community was forced to look directly into the abyss of a reality that it had largely ignored. As the years turn into decades, the specifics of a case, the weapons, the location, the legal charges, and the ultimate, tragic end in the prison cell may soften in the public memory, but the underlying, existential question will remain. How do we ensure the preservation of the most brilliant and marginalized voices in our society, and how do we protect the bonds that allow for the transmission of knowledge and wisdom across the generations? This is the central, enduring challenge of the post-tragedy era, and it is a challenge that can only be met with a sustained, collective commitment to empathy, transparency, and systematic support. We must also acknowledge the resilience of those who have been left behind. The families, the students, the peers, and the wider community have endured a trauma that is both deeply personal and historically significant. Their capacity to continue the work, to remember the beauty of what was achieved, and to advocate for the necessary changes in how mental health is perceived and treated is a testament to the enduring strength of the values that Caroline and Sia themselves championed. They are the ones who carry the burden of the memory, and they are the ones who are shaping the meaning of this tragedy for the future. Their efforts to ensure that the loss of these two women serves as a catalyst for growth rather than a symbol of futility are perhaps the most noble and necessary response to the entire, heartbreaking ordeal. In these final reflections, we return to the quiet, persistent truth of the lives that were lived. Despite the horrific conclusion that now defines their legacy, the accomplishments of both women remain, fixed and undeniable. The academic papers, the novels, the poems, and the countless lessons imparted to students will continue to influence and inspire. The tragedy of their deaths does not invalidate the beauty of their work, nor does it erase the profound, positive impact they had on the lives of those they touched. The task for the future is to hold these two truths in balance, to remember the brilliance that fueled the culture and to acknowledge the darkness that destroyed the individuals. This balance is not easy, and it will require a level of emotional and intellectual sophistication that is as rare and as valuable as the work they created during their lives. The silence that now envelopes the memory of this event is, in its own way, a form of profound respect. It is a space for us to reflect, to grieve, and to learn. It is a space where the noise of speculation and the rush to judgment have finally subsided, leaving behind only the cold, clear reality of a tragedy that has forever changed the landscape of the Pacific. We are left with the lingering, haunting image of the Galamoana Theater, a place that was built for the light but was ultimately defined by the shadow. This is the enduring, final image of our story, a sanctuary that serves as a mirror, forcing us to look at ourselves, our institutions, and the fragile, precious bonds that define our humanity. We are all, in a sense, residents of that space, tasked with the responsibility of safeguarding one another, of protecting the brilliant and the vulnerable, and of ensuring that we never again allow the shadows to overtake the light. As we bring this long, reflective journey to a close, we find that the most profound lesson is also the most basic, that our humanity is our most precious, most fragile resource. We are bound to one another by the stories we share, the knowledge we transmit, and the relationships we nurture, yet we remain entirely vulnerable to the unseen, silent forces that can, in a heartbeat, render those bonds meaningless. The memory of Caroline and Sia is a permanent, haunting, and necessary part of our history, a reminder of the cost of our shared life and the absolute, unwavering necessity of caring for the minds that create, the hearts that mentor, and the spirits that seek to make sense of the world. The echo of their work will continue, the memory of their lives will persist, and the silence of their departure will remain, a quiet, ever-present reminder that the most significant events in our history are often the ones that leave us with nothing to say, but everything to feel. We carry the burden of this knowledge forward, into a future that is forever altered by the tragedy of 2024 and 2026, and we do so with a deeper, more humbled understanding of the absolute, precarious, and irreplaceable nature of the lives that are entrusted to our collective memory. This concludes our exploration, leaving behind the weight of the story to be carried, contemplated, and honored by the generations that will continue to seek meaning in the wake of such a profound and permanent loss. The story is told, the silence is settled, and the memory remains as the only true, lasting testament to the lives that were and the darkness that, despite our best efforts, we must forever strive to hold at bay. The narrative of the Galamoana Theater has reached its conclusion, but the echo of the events remains woven into the very fabric of the Pacific intellectual community. To offer a final, 11th perspective on this tragedy is to look at the persistence of memory and the way a culture processes a wound that refuses to heal. We have moved past the initial shock, beyond the legal attempts at categorization, and through the grim realization of the final act in the prison cell. What remains is the long, slow work of reconciliation. The community is now tasked with integrating this horror into the broader history of the region. It is not an integration that seeks to justify or explain away the violence, but one that acknowledges it as a permanent, albeit devastating, feature of the landscape. We are standing in the aftermath, realizing that the brilliance of the two women, once seen as a soaring, independent force, is now irrevocably tethered to the ground of their tragic end. This final reflection must address the role of the archive in the wake of such profound destruction. In the months and years following the incident, the physical remnants of their lives, the unpublished manuscripts, the personal letters, the annotated drafts, have become artifacts of an unimaginable history. There is a profound sadness in the way these documents are now handled. They are no longer just the tools of an ongoing, vibrant intellectual exchange. They have been transformed into historical evidence, items to be cataloged, protected, and studied with a new, clinical lens. The loss of the living, breathing relationship between the mentor and the protege means that the archives are now silent. They are static objects that can never again be animated by the dialogue, the debate, or the loving guidance that once gave them purpose. This transition from life to archive is the ultimate, quiet death of their collaboration. We also find ourselves contemplating the silence of the village of Viveciuda. For the residents who lived in the shadow of the Galamoana Theater, the tragedy was not a distant, abstract news story. It was an event that occurred in their physical proximity, within the sound of their daily lives. The silence that now defines the theater is a presence for them, a constant reminder of the day the order of their community was disrupted by an explosion of violence that they could not have predicted. The village has had to incorporate this memory into its own history. It is a process that involves the delicate task of honoring the sanctity of the life that was lost while living in the physical reality of the site where the trauma occurred. This local, lived experience of the tragedy is often overlooked in the grander narratives of literature and academic history, yet it is perhaps the most enduring, most grounded aspect of the entire affair. When we consider the broader, international implications, we see the ripple effect of this case in the way mental health is now discussed among expatriate and diaspora communities. The tragedy has become a point of reference for those who navigate the complex, often isolating experience of bridging multiple cultures. It has highlighted the fact that the pressure to succeed as a representative of one's culture is not merely a political or social weight, but an intense psychological burden. The story of Figil's struggle has become a mirror for others who feel the suffocating weight of expectation, a reminder that the path of the trailblazer is rarely as steady or as safe as it appears from the outside. By acknowledging the reality of her collapse, the diaspora community is beginning to create spaces where such struggles can be discussed with greater honesty and less fear of judgment. There is also the matter of the artistic legacy, which is now forever colored by the events of May 2024. The literary world is in the midst of a complex, ongoing reappraisal of the work produced by both women. This is not a process of negation, but one of contextualization. The brilliance of the prose and the depth of the insight remain, but they are now viewed through the somber realization of the darkness that lay in wait. Future critics will likely grapple with this for decades, trying to find the traces of the eventual collapse in the early works, looking for the cracks in the foundation before they were ever visible to the public eye. This is a common, if sometimes flawed, pursuit in the study of any artist whose life ended in trauma, yet in the case of Caroline and Sia, it feels particularly poignant. Their work was, in so many ways, an attempt to define the very things that eventually destroyed them: the weight of the past, the challenge of the present, and the fragility of the self. As we look toward the future, the primary goal of the community must be the maintenance of the legacies that remain. The memory of Caroline Sinaviana-Gabbard, as a beacon of academic courage and nurturing mentorship, must be defended against the encroachment of the scandal that attended her death. Her life's work was the creation of a path for others, and that path must continue to be walked by those she inspired. This means that her contributions to the study of Pacific literature must be kept alive, taught in classrooms, and cited in new research, ensuring that her impact remains defined by her achievements rather than by the tragedy of her final moments. This is the most profound way to honor the victim, by refusing to let her brilliance be eclipsed by the brutality of her end. It is a work of active, purposeful remembering. The memory of Papaliai Sia Figueil presents a much more difficult path, yet it is one that cannot be avoided. To honor her is to acknowledge the raw, transformative power of her art while also confronting the horror of her final years. This requires a balanced, compassionate view that does not seek to excuse the inexcusable, but rather to understand the devastating, crushing nature of the mental illness that took hold of her. She was a creator, a voice of the island, and a human being who fell victim to a disease that robbed her of her essence. By holding these two truths in tandem, the community can find a way to preserve the importance of her work without losing sight of the tragedy she wrought. It is a complex, delicate task, but it is necessary for the integrity of the cultural record. In the end, we find that the most significant outcome of this tragedy is the collective, deepened understanding of the human condition in the Pacific. The event has forced a confrontation with the reality of the darkness that can exist within even the most luminous of settings. It has stripped away the illusions of paradise, revealing instead a reality that is just as complex, just as fragile, and just as worthy of care as any other part of the world. This is a mature, necessary realization for a culture that is continuing to define itself on the global stage. It is a recognition that strength does not come from denying the darkness, but from the ability to witness it, to survive it, and to continue the work of creation despite it. The story of the two women is the story of this transition, a painful initiation into a deeper, more sober understanding of what it means to live, to create, and to care for one another in a world that is fundamentally unpredictable. We are leaving this narrative with a sense of profound, quiet reverence. We have documented the lives, the work, the relationship, the tragedy, and the aftermath. We have stood witness to the collapse of a sanctuary and the destruction of a bond. We have done so with the intention of providing a coherent, respectful account of a series of events that, at their core, defy total comprehension. We have sought to honor the lives that were taken and the lives that were broken, understanding that in the face of such a loss, our primary obligation is to remember. The story is now ours to carry, a part of the historical memory of the Pacific, a testament to the immense, fragile, and often tragic beauty of the human experience. The silence that now remains is not empty. It is filled with the resonance of their work, the memory of their voices, and the weight of their loss. It is a silence that invites us to do the work that remains, the work of mentoring, of writing, of caring, and of building the supports that allow our most brilliant minds to flourish in safety. The theater in Vive Ciudad may be silent, the prison cell may be empty, but the impact of their lives continues to ripple outward, influencing the path of those who will come after. We finish this account with a profound sense of gratitude for the light they brought, and a deep, enduring sorrow for the darkness that finally claimed them. Their memory is now in the hands of the community, to be held with care, to be honored with respect, and to be reflected upon with the wisdom that only time and the passage of years can bring. This is the end of the narrative, A story that began in the light of artistic achievement and ended in the silence of the abyss, leaving us all to contemplate the immense and deeply human cost of the journey.